Jax. Good boy. I'm trying to make a video. You were howling before, and now you two are interrupted. Children. Inconsiderate. Inconsiderate children. You're a good dog, though. Yes. Howard Phillips Lovecraft is one of the most influential horror authors of all time, and is the namesake for an entire subgenre of horror, that being often referred to as Lovecraftian horror. I kind of consider it cosmic horror. And the Necronomicon is a collection of his works that I have gone through a handful of times and listened to not every story multiple times, but I've heard every story within it at least once and listened to my favorites multiple times. So how good is it? And should you read Lovecraft in the first place? First off, let's just go ahead and get out of the way. I believe most videos that talk about Lovecraft address this at some point. Lovecraft was racist. It bled into his writing. Some people can ignore that. Some people can't. Heads up, it's there. Moving on. Personally, one of the biggest selling points for Lovecraft's body of work in general is his subject matter. I love the subgenre of cosmic horror. I really enjoy the thoughts that an entirely alien, inhuman, incomprehensible race, species, or god provokes within myself. I think it's really cool to think about, and it is immediately fascinating and just has inherent interest for me. So that skews me kind of towards a more positive evaluation of Lovecraft's work. But I suppose you can say that about any author of any genre. If you like horror, you're probably going to be more interested in Stephen King. If you like true stories, you probably aren't going to be as interested in a fantasy book. So there's a lot of carryover there. And I primarily read fantasy, but I also enjoy sci-fi, which Lovecraft's work has a strong aspect of sci-fi within it. There's a lot of aliens and things of that nature within his stories. And I also enjoy horror. I especially enjoy horror mixed with fantasy or sci-fi. As far as the primary dish, I don't generally want it to be a horror novel, but I like a strong horror tone on things like fantasy. And Lovecraft, to me, is a bit more like horror with strong sci-fi tones or strong fantasy tones. I believe he's considered more sci-fi than fantasy, but he deals with the gods and stuff. It's all kind of a melting pot. Genres are weird. Something that I find interesting within the interaction of the genre and Lovecraft's writing approach is Lovecraft is very vague. He gives you impressions of what is happening. Oftentimes things are simply described as too horrible for words. Most of the time when our journalist, whoever is writing the entry or the short story, the author and narrator, when they finally encounter this horrible thing, lots of times they're like, I'm not going to write it down, it's too terrible. And while it sounds like it could be frustrating, and if you're at all familiar with my review of Stephen King's Gunslinger, it drove me up a wall how symbolic and vague King was within the writing of that. But because, for one, cosmic horror is inherently more vague, in my opinion, because how do you describe something which is incomprehensible to the human mind? How do you describe an alien voice that human tongues can't mimic, or a new color, or things of that nature? And instead of directly showing it to us, Lovecraft gives you a feeling, an impression, an emotion attached to those things, rather than showing you the things yourself, and your mind is allowed to construct the horror for itself. I'm a super visual reader. Whenever I'm going through a book, I'm continuously playing it like a movie in my head. I'm seeing it the entire time, especially vividly if I am really enjoying the book or if I'm really drawn in. And that happens a lot for me with Lovecraft. Even though my mind doesn't form a clear picture of what it is either. Lots of things it's a shadow in the dark that's creepy, you know? And harkening back to, it gives me the emotion, the feeling attached to that thing, rather than the direct visage of it. Also, because they are short stories, I am much more tolerant of the vagueness and potential lack of explanation. Because you can't cram as much detail into a short story, and I don't have the same expectations for a short story. Whereas with novels, I want to learn about these things that are happening. I want to come to at least partially understand what's going on. Whereas with the short stories, it can just be creepy. It can just be scary and fascinating. And that's okay with me. I don't need to understand within that medium. It's a personal preference of mine. If you disagree, cool. If you want everything to be clear, then Lovecraft's not your guy. If you enjoy vagueness, definitely up your alley. I address quite often within my reviews the prose language writing style of an author, and Lovecraft is a very archaic language, but I think it is somewhat appropriate. Even for an old book, the language he uses is weird. Compared to previous older books I've reviewed before, like Tarzan of the Apes or Dracula, the language is still strange. But most of our narrators are highly educated. And often, when uneducated people are speaking, they sound like uneducated people. I think it is sort of to convey that our narrator is highly educated, but I think it's also just kind of how Lovecraft writes. It's a mix of the two. As I mentioned before, Lovecraft is racist, but he was also mentally ill. H.P. Lovecraft did not have a good life. And maybe I'm overanalyzing his works here, but I feel like these stories are sort of an insight into his mind, or a reflection of his mind that I think is fascinating. I really enjoy subjects like psychology and the implications that the stories have about what's going on with him, because often our characters are affected by drug use or simple delirium, and the character themselves is left wondering whether any of this all happened or if they're just crazy. Which is freaky, for the fact, because I think we can all imagine a situation where we get abducted by an alien or something, something crazy like that happens. Then we're thrown back to Earth. It happened to you, but then other people aren't going to believe you. And you're not going to expect them to believe you. And you can have a lot of doubt associated with that. Whereas Lovecraft was very afraid of many things. And I think that characteristic of his writing is reflective of his own internal fears and doubts, whether those fears are legitimate or internal debate with whether he's just crazy. Now, take this all with a grain of salt. I'm talking out of my ass because I didn't know Lovecraft. I'm not a psychologist. This could all be bullshit. But it was an interesting narrative that my mind constructed. Okay? Now, the question that this video is meant to answer. Should you read H.P. Lovecraft? I hope that through this video and through an explanation of the type of stories that you can expect from Lovecraft through my perspective, you have been provided enough information to make that decision yourself. If you're not comfortable reading clearly racist stories, that makes sense. You can just pass up on them. If you hate archaic language in your stories, you can pass up on them. If you're just really not into cosmic horror, that's almost his entire body of work, so you can pass up on Lovecraft. But if these are not gateways that you can't pass through, then I highly recommend that you do look into H.P. Lovecraft, because his work has been extremely influential on the genre of horror, cosmic horror specifically, and I think they are quite simply fascinating and enjoyable to read. Thank you all for watching. Drop a like and hit that subscribe button if you enjoy my content. Thanks again. Peace out.